Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Melbourne conversation. My name is Helen Sullivan, and I'm the director of the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Repeat attenders of these events will know that the Melbourne conversation is a public dialogue. It's an opportunity for the city to expose and engage citizens in key strategic issues that need attention and that deserve discussion. And the future of our cities and what makes a great city and our cities finished, all of these questions are really important, and we're very fortunate to have you all here to contribute to that discussion. It's a curious subject, this, London recipe, Melbourne ingredients. Some of you may have detected that I'm not an Australian, and indeed I hail from the UK and spent 20 years in Birmingham, where we probably wouldn't think about London recipe as being the ingredients for a great city. And that's one of the fantastic things about the UK, that there are any number of cities that see themselves as being great in their own way and are in constant, interesting competition with each other to demonstrate what makes a great city. But London, of course, is the city that everybody knows, and it is the city that Charles has written about in many different ways, and is something that he'll be talking about this evening. So I should get on and introduce him. So Charlie Leadbeater, as I've known him, is one of the world's foremost thinkers on innovation and creativity, and has worked across all sectors. He's worked with government, he's worked with the not-for-profit sector, he's worked with any number of private companies, and has also worked at all levels of government, which I think is really important. Author of numerous best-selling books, including We Think, which was probably one of the most interesting books on thinking about how participation can, in and of itself, be a source of creativity and disruption and innovation, but numerous other books too, all of which seem to... I tend to think about Charlie as Madonna. He's kind of always that bit ahead of the trend, you know? He thinks of things like social entrepreneurship before anybody else starts talking about them, and always has something interesting to say about them. I'm not quite sure if he is as wealthy as Madonna, but maybe somebody would like to ask him that. But numerous books, all of which have led us to think about emerging trends in new ways. And this evening, I think, will be no different. Another thing to say, though, about Charlie is that in addition to the numerous awards that he's won, in 2005, Accenture rated him one of the top management thinkers in the world. He's an award-winning journalist. Somewhere deep in his bio is the reference to the fact that he was an associate editor at the time that Helen Fielding was creating Bridget Jones' Diaries, so he has some influence in shaping that extraordinary social movement, if you like. But one of the things that's always impressed me about him is that not only is he a writer and a thinker, he's also a doer. So he has got his hands dirty in the space of activism, most particularly, to my mind, with as co-founder of the public service innovation organisation Participle, but also as an advisor at Demos and at the Young Foundation and many other places. So we really are in for a pretty... authoritative account of what makes a city great, and how Melbourne might do that in its own unique way, drawing on lessons from elsewhere. So please join me in welcoming Charlie.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed, Helen, for that introduction. You come all the way to Melbourne to be confronted with someone from Birmingham who wants to take on London. And actually, I did meet Madonna once. Actually, I met Madonna before she was famous, before she'd issued a record, when I was researching a programme for television in the United States, and a friend of mine had gone to interview her for Face magazine, and he said, "You've got to come out to dinner with this girl, she's going to be famous." And I left after the second course because I couldn't kind of take it any longer. And I am definitely not as rich as Madonna. And I am going to talk a bit about London and what has made London so successful. And I'll say a little bit about why I was interested in that question. But whilst flying up from Sydney earlier, I did start thinking about the Queen. Obviously, it was her birthday yesterday, which is kind of noted here, but not actually in the UK at all, really. And I was wondering what she must think, really. Here she is, 90. She's been through every imaginable kind of crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the IRA have tried to kill her, the Berlin Wall has collapsed, most of her family's marriages have collapsed, and here she is at the age of 90, presumably, expecting some gracious departure, and the entire political system collapses around her because they have a sort of nervous breakdown. So the Queen, I think, is the world's sort of coper-in-chief. If there was a sort of ideology called copism, the Queen would be the sort of lead ideologist of copism. And number 2 would be Angela Merkel. She's also one of the world's great copers. In fact, all of the top 10 slots in the coping league table are taken by middle-aged women. And actually, there's something. No men appear in the top 10 copers, because it's not heroic enough for men. But there she is, this sort of indomitable coper. And you can just sort of imagine her raising an eyebrow. I did actually think that she might just call them all in and say, look, guys, you've got to get your acts together. Because here we have a party with the name Conservative, which might imply a sort of favour for the familiar and the status quo, which has taken not one but 2 risks with its own position and the state of the nation, and is now being held together by some sort of evangelical Christians from Northern Ireland. And we are presenting ourselves as a sort of modern, global, outward-looking kind of nation. That's sort of, only in Britain could you go forward into the future by regressing into the past ever and ever. So why did I get interested in London? Well, I thought it was just a very interesting thing what had happened to London as a city, and how it had become kind of at ease with itself, particularly in the early part of this century, that decade, and around the time of the Olympics. And I thought it was also a really interesting question, is what makes a Londoner? Because I remember, days gone by, being a Londoner was someone who came from London. They were born in London, possibly in the East End, and they had a distinctive kind of accent. And just through my sort of daily interaction with the city, travelling on buses and walking around, I wonder what is it that makes a Londoner now, a modern Londoner in this hugely diverse global city. And I remember my own experience of that I grew up in a town outside London called Basingstoke in Hampshire. And when we used to go to London, it was like the dam busters, because we would all sort of have to line up and put sort of, helmets on, and it was run like a military exercise. And the key thing was crossing the South Circular. And if you could get across the South Circular into London, that was sort of entering enemy territory then, and you were liable to be sort of shot down or something. So the South Circular, in my dad's imagination, driving his Morris 1100, was like a sort of third ring of hell. The real danger was you might get trapped on the South Circular and just go round the South Circular over and over and over again. And so we would retreat from London, and everyone would sort of dust themselves off and sort of having survived the metropolis. And that, in my parents' imagination, was what London was. It was sort of interesting, but not somewhere you would actually want to live, for all sorts of reasons. So after university, I moved to London, and I didn't really feel like a Londoner for, I would say, the first 10 years of living in London. And I can remember the day that it came home to me that I was a Londoner now, and I really started to identify with it. And it was about 25 years ago, and the woman I'd just fallen in love with had just told me that I was bald. And so I had to go straight to the hairdressers and get a kind of really severe haircut. And then I got into my car to drive to my parents' house. They, by this stage, moved to Yorkshire. And I was wearing what could only be described as a very ill-thought-out jumper from a shop called Yohji Yamamoto. Now, if you try and combine the words Yohji Yamamoto and Basingstoke, you will see that there's a bit of a problem, because in Basingstoke, basically, you wore what was sold in Marks and Spencer's. If Marks and Spencer's sold it, you wore it. And the fact that my mum was on first-name terms with the manager of Marks and Spencer was like we were minor royalty in Basingstoke, because we had that sort of connection. So anyway, I set off up the motorway, about to tell my parents that I'd fallen in love with the woman I intended to marry and have kids with, wearing Yohji Yamamoto jumper with this very severe haircut, because this woman had told me that I was bald. And I got to my parents' house. Now, just to picture my parents' house in the Dales in Yorkshire, if you imagine the people who made Wallace and Gromit had actually built houses, this was what their house looked like. It was like something out of Wallace and Gromit. And I arrive, and I get out of the car, and I press the doorbell, and my mum opens the door, and she looks me up and down, and she says, shouting into the house to my father, "Bill, Charles has arrived, he's got AIDS." And that was what she thought going to London meant. It was that you'd get some sort of really serious condition. And so then I realised I actually was now a Londoner. And I think what being a Londoner means now, fundamentally, is that you are not just at ease with difference, you actively seek it out. And being a Londoner means to sign up to difference, to sign up to the pleasure, the joy, the excitement, sometimes the frustration, the bewilderment, but the difference is what London is all about. It is a celebration now of difference, and an acceptance that to be different you have to welcome, to draw in, to be open-minded, and that there have to be ways for all of that to come together. And if London has a recipe for that, I think it's this really, that good cities, I think, live partly on systems. Well, actually, cities wouldn't really work unless there were systems for money, for finance, for communication, crucially for transport, of course, for energy and heating. Everyone here will not have done very much to by way of self-subsistence. Today they will have relied on systems that they will have swiped and flicked and touched, and they will have come to life. And so systems are very important for cities to work at scale. And scale is very important for diversity. It's very difficult to get real diversity unless you've got a degree of scale. It's very difficult to connect people up unless you've got these systems that make cities work. So that immediately raises questions about how cities can think about these systems and plan for their future, and how they can finance it. One of the big questions that will kind of hang over all cities and all nations is the relationship between city finance and national finance, and whether cities get the right to plan their own futures and their own finances, or whether the nation will continue to take the lion's share of the proceeds. That relationship will be very contested. It's right at the heart of what's happening in London at the moment. But there are things about London where there aren't systems, and perhaps there should be. There is no real system for housing. And one of London's biggest problems is housing, affordable housing. And that is partly because it's all a sort of mom-and-pop business of people renting out rooms in small houses and so on and so forth, and we don't actually do it like a system. One of the other biggest challenges in London is childcare. So lots of my daughter's friends are now in their early 30s. They're just becoming parents. To become a parent in London is now either to go in for sort of completely life-changing decisions about whether you're going to work, or a second mortgage, basically, because your outgoings double immediately you get engaged in the childcare. And so there's no system, really, for childcare. There's no sort of thinking at scale about what that should be. So systems and the ability of cities to think about systems system is very important. But the second thing that's really important is empathy. That cities have to have this capacity to engage and overcome difference. And that might be just a very sort of day-to-day way of kind of walking through a street or sitting in a restaurant. But in a much bigger way, it's about how cities make the most of the difference that is there by people overcoming what separates them from other people and actually taking an interest and caring about the outcome. So cities thrive on this sort of social sense of freedom, that you go to cities not to be on your own to be free, but to be with other people to be free. And so their presence creates your freedom, because their presence helps you do things that might be otherwise difficult to do. It's much easier to work in a city because there are other people with complementary skills. It's much easier to get things that other people provide. So this sort of coping with trust and diversity and collaboration requires this sort of secret source of empathy. And I think of empathy as a sort of dark matter of cities. It's got to be there, but you very rarely see it in the open. But if it isn't there, everything starts to fall to bits. And one of the significances of the terrorist attacks, and before that, in a different way, the riots, 2011, were that they were an attack on this. And what's interesting is the response of the city to that, to try and kind of, if you like, heal itself. So if you think about these two ingredients, systems and empathy, then you get this very, for me, pleasing little grid, which means that I know where I am because I've created this sort of 2x2. And you can imagine you've got sort of high system experiences and low system experiences, which might be good or bad, and low empathy and high empathy experiences. Well, the place you don't want to be is down here, and that is in fact what London was like in the 18th century. It was a place of no systems and no empathy. It was completely brutal, but also amazing at the same time, and it had everything in it. Every conceivable thing, good and bad, existed in London, but it was a fairly kind of challenging place, if you like. And so in the 19th century, we had a series of reforms to create systems, which were then also the basis for empathy. In the modern city, one of the biggest challenges, I think, for London, a kind of hidden challenge, is, I would say, one of the biggest challenges is isolation. Actually, loneliness is probably the biggest challenge in London. It's loneliness that creates problems in old age. It's loneliness and lack of attachment that creates problems amongst young people in many ways. Cities can be enormously lonely places for lots of people. And I would say the biggest social challenge in some ways is the loneliness of older people in London, their sheer isolation in a city that's moving too fast. So a lot about cities is finding this combination of high system and high empathy. And you can see people sort of going between them. And the system city, this is Canary Wharf, this was system city. I think it's a complete failure, really, as a sort of development. And actually they do too now, because they're trying to redesign it, and the next stage of Canary Wharf will look completely different. And the reason for that is that these are just built as sort of factories for finance, really. There's no social life, there's no engagement with community, there's no public space, there's no public life whatsoever. And down here, there are lots of examples where you can get low system but highly relational things, like this. This is a fantastic development at King's Cross by Argent, where they've just simply put these steps in and invited people to create their own patterns of being and patterns of kind of pleasure. But this is empathy in action, it seems to me. And it's what's important about this is that if you're not part of it, the fact that you see it has a great significance for you. Because actually, if public spaces are designed for young and old people, but particularly for women, to be safe in, that is a huge signal to everyone else. And if particularly they're women from an ethnic minority, that's an even bigger signal. So this, in a sense, is a really important statement about what the city is like, as is this. I've never known a development that has these fountains that isn't a great place to be. And this was a kind of response to the 2011 riots, that out of the crisis, You mobilise that story about London, the Blitz, collective spirit, empathy returns. But the real question is, can you do this? Can you get both high system and high empathy? Can you get experiences which operate at scale and yet have this very human quality to them? And often in cities, as you go to more systematic solutions, you lose human scale. You lose this sort of ability to connect. But what happened in the Olympics was, of course, that we completely surprised ourselves by managing to do exactly that. Because the amazing thing was, it all actually worked. I mean, no one expected that to be true. That was as shocking as Jeremy Corbyn's surge, the fact that it all actually worked. And it kind of, I remember leaving the Paralympics and thinking, getting in a queue and thinking, this is going to take hours. There are loads of people. It's just going to take ages. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, I was on a train and winging my way back home. So that's because there were systems. And it was planned, and there was leadership, and there was investment and infrastructure and ambition and vision. But it was also a place of great empathy that people celebrated and kind of came together. And the atmosphere created by the ambassadors, the volunteers, was absolutely central to that, as was the filling of the city with that kind of spirit. But the other place that you feel this combination of systems and empathy is when you travel around London. One of the great success stories of the last few years in London has been the transformation of Transport for London. Transport for London is the most democratic and important institution in London. It's far more important than the Greater London Assembly or any borough. It is the daily democratic experience of living in London, and it was run during this transformation by a brilliant guy called David Hendy, who was a kind of model civil servant and public official, spent his entire life in London Transport, started as a train driver, and each day he would start his day by trying to work out what was happening in his network. And his staff would tell him that he was wasting his time by responding to inquiries and worrying about kind of little things. But he said, unless you know what's actually happening, then you're just telling people a kind of story. But the kind of level of both the sort of the system working, but then allowing, in a sense, the citizens to get on with organising themselves is a really, really important lesson, I think, for what makes London successful. And you see it in other places. You see it in aspects of culture. Now also in London's education system, one of the most improved education systems in Britain, possibly in the world. This doesn't look like it, but this is empathy. What is holding those people together there is a sort of sullen kind of empathy, that they are prepared to stand there together and endure a bad side of the railway experience. So what would you focus on if you wanted to follow that recipe? Well, I think you would focus on what I call social technologies, and those are things that make us more efficient and more productive and make life more affordable by being social. The more social you are, the more efficient you are, the more you achieve what you want. And so just to give you some examples of things that might be a bit like that, the sharing economy's got probably a bit of a bad name now, but I think there is still something very important in the idea of creating in cities a notion of shared lives through childcare, through looking after people through other means. And so I think you will see a continued growth in sharing in cities. I think particularly around transport, and perhaps particularly around cars. One of the biggest problems in London is just the dreadful quality of the air. I mean, it's really, really dirty. And it was sort of covered up during Boris's tenure that the air was so dirty. But Sadiq Khan has now made it a real focus. And I think in less than 20 years, we will think it was really remarkable that we walked around cities next to combustion engines, churning this stuff out in the mouths and lungs of our children. It would just seem like kind of factories in the 19th century or something. It would just seem really bizarre. So I think sharing and automated and electric forms of transport are going to be crucial to that. The idea in Helsinki that no one's going to really own a car, in Berlin moving in that direction as well. But a really good example, one of the best in Europe, I think, about shared living, which I think should be taken up more broadly, is the example of Freiburg, where they've had this fantastic mixture of public development with self-building to create these fantastic Baugruppen houses, which are owned by families in groups, aimed to be affordable for someone on median earnings, and designed so that a parent in a top-floor flat can shout to their children playing in the street or the yard or the alley below. That, I think, is a really creative example of sharing, as is the reinvention of old institutions. I know Melbourne has some fantastic libraries, and I know there's a new one being planned. This is Amsterdam Public Library. It's the oldest idea, but actually a fantastic reinvention of it to create a space which is full the whole time of people pursuing all sorts of different interests. I think growing and making will be important to cities, to populate them with green, like this incredible edible in Todmorden in Yorkshire, but also if you go to Detroit, actually where Detroit is, one of the places that Detroit is coming back from is coming back from food and farming and greening of the city and growing and making. This is Eastern Market. The amazing thing about going to Eastern Market in Detroit is the noise. Because actually Detroit is really quiet most of the time, and that's because there aren't very many people there. But they come together at this place over a weekend. And so maker spaces and that whole making movement, the repopulation of cities by forms of manufacturing, starting often with craft beer, craft coffee, craft other things, I think that's going to be an important part of cities of the future. The most basic thing is sitting and talking. I often say to people that if they want one thing, if there's one idea to make a city really great, it's a good chair, basically. And this is my favorite example. This is Bryant Park in New York, one of the most used public spaces in the world, where they had a design plan for the park, and they got some very beautiful benches done, and then they decided that they would be too inflexible. They looked beautiful, but they were too inflexible, and they just borrowed the idea of these chairs from Paris, in fact, the Tuileries Gardens. And so each day at the start of the day in Bryant Park, there are loads of chairs, and people come and they put them out in different simple, modular, repeatable technology that can be used easily by anyone. And they put them out in different kind of arrangements according to what they need. And each day the arrangement is slightly different. And it leaves this kind of shadow of social activity in the park of these vacant chairs where people were sitting. And then they get collected up and then they get reused the next day. And I think this is a really fantastic idea of a sort of very practical social technology that is designed to allow people to be more effective and more social at the same time. And then, of course, walking and cycling. If you were designing a transport system for the city of the future, of course, you would think about drones and self-driving cars and electric cars, but also you just think about cycling and walking, actually. Really old technologies that would make cities really livable again. And so this is Portland. Portland has turned itself into a cycling city. It wasn't always. But it turned itself into a cycling city through a series of infrastructural improvements, but a string of social enterprises, kind of cycling movement, kind of health movement, and it all came together to create this city where now masses of people cycle on an almost European scale. And again, the thing that I think is interesting about bikes is not just what they do for you if you're cycling, it's what they do for you if you're around and about, because they are a pretty harmless, ecologically friendly human technology, and they signal something about the city. So the fact that all these bike schemes have spread now around cities is not just about cycling, it's about signaling something about the city's ambitions for itself, that it should be accessible and human and environmentally sustainable. And then walking, the oldest technology of them all. Actually, the healthiest cities will be walking cities, of course. And one of the joys about London is to wander through it, often along alleys or courses or roads that are quite ancient and were never designed really for cars. But this is a brilliant example of the river walk in Seoul, where the mayor took away the highway that was running across this river and turned it into this walk with this fantastically done seat here, which is actually a wall. And this is, if you know the work of Jan Gehl or William White, Small Urban Spaces, it's walls like this that invite people to sit on. And when people sit and linger, then other people do too. And it creates this sort of incredibly convivial, very human, but also very practical kind of little infrastructure for people to move around their city. And so you get things like this. People actually crossing a river without a safety thing on stepping stones. Or a scene like this, which for me said, actually, this is a kind of livable place. Women talking, completely relaxed, by a river in the middle of the city. That's a kind of symbol of what Seoul is trying to create, even if it's only in this small instant. Or this, in China, I sort of think this is a model for health systems of the future. That actually the health systems of the future are going to be much more communal, much more social, much more preventable, and they're going to be out there with people doing things rather than in hospitals, which are costly and often counterproductive. So at the core of this, and at the core of London, is, I think, the significance of what's happening in London and perhaps in other cities, is the creation of a kind of new kind of social contract. And that cities need to be able to constantly renew their social contract. But this social contract is not just between the state and the citizen. The really important social contract in London is among the citizens. It's a kind of lateral social contract. And the most important way that the city governs itself is bilateralism. It's by citizens governing themselves day to day on platforms created by the public within frameworks provided by the law, but this self-governing capacity is the real key to the city, it seems to me. And the state's role has got to be to enable, support, shape sometimes participation in that kind of culture. And in that sense, this creation of this notion of citizenship as collective self-governance rather than participation in a state is a very important step, I think, in a sort of new kind of citizenship, which is why cities are so popular. That is why people are moving to cities, because they want this kind of sense of being a citizen. And the correlate of it, finally, is that London has a very peculiar governance structure. It's not really a state. It's a sort of patchwork of all sorts of different things, because there's sort of national government, which is in London and makes laws for government. There's this newly created mayoralty, which no one really quite knows what it's supposed to be doing, maybe bikes, maybe the Olympics. But, you know, it runs transport, it runs the police, except they kind of run themselves and the mayor doesn't really have that much purchase on them. And so then it's this sort of influencing power on the rest of the city, shaping, setting the tone, setting the culture. And then you've got 33 boroughs as well. So you've got this entire patchwork. And you would think that that would be a recipe for disaster. But actually it's been a recipe for London's success, entirely by accident and not by design at all. Because actually, if the government running London was too strong, then actually London would have become over-planned, over-systematized and over-centralized. And its civic capacity would have been dwarfed by its state capacity, acting in consort perhaps with its corporate capacity. But the fact that the state has been relatively weak and disaggregated has meant that London has this capacity to renew itself from within and from below. So that, I think, is where London has got to. Can it and I'll leave it here. Can it really survive, prosper, in a world of Brexit with all this uncertainty? I honestly don't know. I did, before I left to come to Australia a week ago, I had an hour with the guy who's in charge of inward investment into the UK, and he said that, contrary to expectations, inward investment was doing really well, and into London in particular it was doing really well. And that's a really interesting kind of thought, what doing really well is, because whether that inward investment is really the kind of investment a city needs or wants to make it good, I think is a really open question. We're getting lots of kind of what are in effect safe deposit boxes in the form of flats, basically. So London's going up, and basically above 5th floor, they're basically all financial products, but they look like flats. There's an apocryphal story that someone from the mayor's office told me, that now architects, when they're designing new developments in London, are having to install self-flushing toilets, which flush every 6 hours. Because if the water isn't changed every now and again, there's a risk of getting Legionnaire's disease. And some of these flats, the toilets are never flushed. The non-flushing toilet. So this is a phenomena of London's success. So the biggest problem of London, I think, is not Brexit, in fact. The biggest problem is its own success. The biggest problem is the influx of unconstrained, unattached capital, which isn't interested in this story at all. It's just interested in having a piece of the action played out through real estate. And that, I think, is the biggest problem, because that then means a couple of other things which are now central to the agenda for London. One of the things that Helen didn't mention in her very flattering introduction is that I've just been made by Mayor Sadiq Khan a cultural ambassador to London. So here I am in my role as ambassador with my Ferrero Rocher chocolates. But the big challenge in London is there are two, I think, that are going to be really important. One actually is the impact that artificial intelligence and technology may have on its key financial services industries, which is much, much more important than Brexit in the long term for how those industries work. But the other is that it's simply unaffordable. And if you make cities unaffordable, you make them uninteresting, because they become places only for rich people. And in my experience, rich people are really dull. And actually, if you want an interesting city, you have to have all sorts of people. But you only get that if you have the public policy, the imagination, the wit, the will, the wherewithal to make them affordable for a real diversity of people. So London could be about to sort of shoot itself in the head in a way, but it may, hopefully, enjoy a new wave of growth and creativity. Thank you.
You have to sit in this chair, Charlie.
Right. Sorry.
I just want to start with where you ended, really, which is that, you know, some of the narrative about London is not the London that you described in the bulk of your talk. It is the London that is where people, store cash, where huge swathes of London are not really inhabited anymore because they're all owned by oligarchs who live overseas, and that London is not a city in any conventional sense of the word, but is one of these global places where a group of people that we know as the global elite light on for some period and then move somewhere else, and are not ever part of this framework that you describe. You know, they're completely disconnected and don't need to be connected. So for them, the social contract is not something that you would have described. It's something completely other. And of course, the great expression of this is inequality. And so I just wonder how you, just to probe where you ended a little bit further, how is London going to and whether it's the mayor or the cultural ambassadors or whoever, but what would your recipe, if you like, be for continuing the success and not falling into London becoming this entirely sanitised, disconnected, non-flushing toilet place?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of non-flushing toilets, but one shouldn't think that that's all of the city, or indeed all of the reason why people from abroad are investing in it. Because part of the reason it's attracted to people, for instance, who live under authoritarian regimes, is that they like that culture of citizenship and self-governance and the kind of life that it leads within a framework where London is also sort of peculiarly familiar, reliable, old-fashioned as well, in some kind of sense, that the people that I know who are making those investments or interested in doing those kinds of things are drawn by that as well. It's not purely financial, although some of it, of course, is, and it could be Dubai or it could be Miami or wherever. The second thing is that London, I mean, it is interesting. I did a study looking at people living in London on average earnings and below, and I was interested in what it was like to live in London, how people were coping if they were earning, £20,000 or something like that. And by and large, they told me two stories. One was, we're here because this is a big story. This is a sort of dramatic city. And if you're earning £20,000 in the central borders, there's nothing to do. But if you're earning £20,000 in London, okay, you're not well off and there are all sorts of compromises, but as long as you can get on a bus, you can kind of feel that you're part of this sort of huge unfolding story. So there was a sort of attachment to the drama of the city. But there was also a kind of, in London, there's this very strong sort of hyphenated identity that you're never really from London, you're from, I mean, I'm from Highbury. I wouldn't dream of going anywhere near South London, and so these identities of, Willesden Green or Queen's Park or Stoke Newington, these are still really important to people, I think, in London, this sort of hyphenated sense. So, and that, I think, is different from smaller cities where you might identify with the entire place, Sheffield, although even there you might identify with Broomall or what have you. So I think it's sort of a complicated picture. And that hyphenated London, the foreign investors never get to. They never understand. They never see, really. It's a sort of other world, really, to them. But that is where a lot of the life of the city is now lived. And one of the big questions about the city will be whether basically the area inside the Circle Line is sort of, this isn't quite right, but let's say it's like Dubai, basically. So then all the creativity and all the real life of London happens around the Circle Line and out, and then along key arteries, going out to Dagenham, which will be part of the future. Walthamstow will be part of the future. And so the city's creativity will become sort of disaggregated in kind of interesting ways that we haven't yet understood how that will play out.
And so I think you could have an interesting conversation with people here about the difference between North Melbourne and South Melbourne and who goes across the Yarra River and whether, that's a good thing to do or not. But I think there is certainly some of that felt in Melbourne, although perhaps not as strongly as London. But I think one of the other differences with Melbourne is that the idea of the city of Melbourne means many different things. So, the world's most livable city is not necessarily what people out in Greater Dandenong or Geelong or anywhere else would understand. It's a very defined space. And so this question of what it is to be a city, how important do you think it is that there is some sort of shared identity, whether it's hyphenated or not?
Yeah, I think important, because there's got to be a shared commitment. And I think what London has been really good at has been absorbing people into its story. So, it's one of the largest French cities, for instance. It's certainly one of the most significant African cities now. But one of the things it hasn't been good at is what it means for the white working class in southeast London, who every time you go along a tube stop, life expectancy goes down by 2 years. And so and their sense of the city would be very narrow, and the hyphenated identity there plays against them, because actually it then becomes the housing estate or the 300, 400 yards that their city might, because they would never think of going to the centre of the city. It's not for them. There's no point. They've got no money, or it's alien territory, and that, I think, is that's a really big challenge.
And what is it? One of the things that struck me while you were talking was so much of what you described, particularly in terms of public space, public transport, those really powerful examples. You didn't necessarily talk about that in terms of the public, although you might have done. And I just wonder, what does it mean to be? Have the divisions between public and private now become interchangeable or collapsed, or because what does it mean to be public? Because of course one manifestation of public is very system driven, and where we're all in it together, and that means we all have our front door painted blue or whatever it is, whereas what you're describing is something that is at one and the same time highly individual potentially, but also then can involve smaller social groups. So I'm just wondering, if you're trying to plan something like this, where does an idea of the public now fit?
Yes, I think that's a really good question, because one of the things that, of course, London has very important public institutions. It's got really critical public cultural institutions which help set the tone of the city, the British Museum, the British Library, all of that cultural stuff, and so that's very important to it. But it's had this much improved secondary education system. It's got massive health investments which are public. So the sort of public dynamism of the place is a very important part of it. And I think that, basically what I think is that has helped create a sort of space for a sort of commons, in some sense, a commons of knowledge and service and ideas, which is a counterbalance to the corporate culture of the city, which otherwise would be too dominant, I think. And it's not often recognised, I think, for instance, in the role of creative industries in London, just how important the public institutions have been in making that available. But I think it's actually quite an old recipe, this idea of creating public spaces where a variety of activities can happen and different things can go on within a public sphere. I think that's quite a sort of Victorian idea in some way, but being played out now in more modern ways. So the interesting thing is that Argent development, which was a public-private, Camden took a big risk with Argent. The first tenant was an educational institution, and they developed this public space. It is absolutely the best development in London. Google are going to be there. It's going to create masses of wealth in a private sense. They have approached it more like a sort of imaginative public developer in some sense. And one of the things that has done is then make other private developers realise that they need to invest in the public in order to make the private valuable. So there is this sort of kind of weird trade-off.
And what drove that? What drove that sense of wanting to behave more like
well, in their case, what drove it was they actually believed it, so they dared to stand for something. But also just to sort of they wanted to make a good development. They thought that was it, but actually they thought it would make in the long run a more valuable development by creating that kind of civic space, and by getting the arts institution to be the core tenant. That set from the start a kind of certain sort of seal to it. If they'd got a bank as their core tenant, it would have been a completely different feel, I think. So I think there are more people who understand that interconnection between public and private now. But I still think that basically the big problem is that the increase in land values in London have not played back into the public enough. That's the big kind of regeneration problem, is that there's been too much taking. I mean, it's very striking what's happened to property prices in Hackney, for instance, where I used to live sort of 20 years ago. And I left Hackney when we had our fourth child, and I was fed up taking him for walks in his pram in this place called London Fields, which, you know, there were needles and stuff like that. And I thought, I've got to do better than this. We left. No sooner had we left that people with fixie bikes started appearing. And now London Fields has turned into like the scene of a festival. But so there's this public space which has sort of been reanimated. And now we couldn't afford to move back to Hackney. I mean, it's out of our price range by a long way, because actually the value has gone up. And actually at the heart of it is this public space, which has been turned into a sort of, you know, one way to sort of create a sort of economy of cool and property, and all of that's gone together. Not enough of that goes back. That's the problem.
And that then picks up on something you started with, which is this, you know, what is the relationship between a nation state and a national government, and then cities, and the financial responsibilities that each have.
Well, and also the capacity of the city. If we were starting again, you would. I mean, Copenhagen is interesting because the city has enough money to invest as a city in certain kinds of developments as a public developer, so that when the prices rise at the meat market, actually a share of it goes back to the public. And what we lacked, of course, is what they had in Freiburg with Vauban, where the public is a participant in the development, and the money comes back, or some of the money comes back into something that then helps. And that's a problem in London, because without that, then the funding of the affordable and the public, which is absolutely vital to the civic and cultural life of the city, becomes harder. You know, so commerce will kill the city eventually, left to its own devices.
And where does the state then come in for that? I mean, is the capacity of the state to change that with somebody like the London mayor, you know, and it goes back to what you were saying about setting the tone, sending cultural signals. Is that within the purview of the mayor to at least attempt to make a claim for what London should be?
Yeah. So the mayor would then have to, which is why then the capacity of the mayoralty and who's the mayor and what that agenda is. And interestingly, in London and in the UK, the most advance in that has not been made by London, it's been made by Manchester, which has got the most comprehensive deal in terms of autonomy and all the rest of it. And actually London needs to have something much more like that. But it's interesting that Manchester has managed to do that, because Manchester has much more political cohesion and ambition, and in that sense has a sort of political class because of its kind of historic status in some ways. Yeah, and I guess Melbourne is probably more like London in the sense that it's the governance is much more complex, in that, you know, you have the state, you have and then you have a whole variety of local governments whose existence, very much like in the UK, is dependent upon, you know, the state. It's not constitutionally established, but they are incredibly important institutions. And so I think there are some real parallels that people might want to pick up on. One of the discussions that's been happening in Australia over the last few weeks, and we've talked about it a fair bit in Canberra, Paul Keating, one of the past prime ministers, made a speech a little while ago in which he talked about neoliberalism. The era of neoliberalism is over. And of course, there's a great case for saying that there was never an era of neoliberalism in Australia. But nonetheless, it precipitated this great debate about, you know, are we on the cusp of something new, unexpected? And this was pre the British election. But it did start me thinking about
when you were talking about cultural messages, some of the symbols, and particularly in terms of transport, which you talked about as a daily democratic experience, where it doesn't matter who you are, you're all in that tube or on that bus together. And I remember Margaret Thatcher making a speech years and years ago when I was young and impressionable, where she talked about if you were a young man and you'd reached the age of 30 and you were still travelling on public transport, then you were a failure. And it's so interesting to me now that completely the reverse is the case in London, and how that message has been just changed so completely. And I just wonder, is that something that has there was any sense of being planned, or was it just something that happened as a result of people caring more about?
I think it was a mixture of different things. So one really important thing about London transport is its tradition of design. So it has a fantastic design tradition, which was a sort of act of care for the public, that it designed things so well, the route master bus, but also the signage and all the rest of it. And although a lot of that was sort of obliterated in the 70s, the memory of that has remained, and I think that's been a bit of an inspiration for some of the people in London transport. I think there was, after the King's Cross fire, there was a sort of reinvestment, and so stations got cleaner, better, escalators worked. And there was a lot of very basic stuff done about reliability, just making sure the trains did run, and also then on customer service. So generally the staff are incredibly friendly, very helpful. They've shifted out of, after some sort of dispute, they've shifted out of ticket offices onto station concourses, which, banks should have done that years ago. So there's been a lot of different things, but amongst the other things that is really interesting is that they've been very alert to open data. And so they have led the way, really, in understanding that it's basically a communication business as well as a transport business. And if you want happy customers, you've got to keep communicating with them, and you've got to learn what they're doing and help them. And the way to do that is to collect the data but then reuse it, and to allow other people then to make countless bus apps and other things. So now planning how to get around London with the help of your phone is a kind of easy thing and a sort of pleasing thing to do. So it's been a combination of those different kinds of things, but I do think it's a kind of model of public entrepreneurship in that sense. I mean, as is the British Library in its way, as is the British Museum. I mean, there are other examples too of that, but I think it's really, really important.
And certainly, I mean, I think we'd have the same conversation about transport in Melbourne, and I was talking to somebody the other day about the role that very poor transport played in state elections over previous years. And also Melbourne is home to some fantastic public institutions. This is one, the State Library is another. And the discussion about libraries in Melbourne is so different from the discussion about libraries in the UK. I mean,
in what sense?
Well, in the sense that they're not being starved of funding, and they are seen as exactly as you describe. And if anybody, I don't know if anybody's from Dandenong, but if anybody's been out to Dandenong recently, they have the most amazing public library now, which is so well used and so about being creative and innovative, but definitely public.
And that library along there is a fantastic example of sort of public kind of creativity of a sort of unfolding kind on this old base with that incredible kind of space. That one of my kind of hobbies is to go in state libraries in Australia, which are incredible experiences, and that is one of them. But what the thing that you feel along there is that feeling that you get in Amsterdam is a feeling of a sort of public, creative, open, dynamic culture, which is of high value and high expectations and so on and so forth. So I think that's been a model story over a very long period of time. And the other thing that's really interesting, I mean, going back to the public transport thing, is as you go around the world, bikes are very important and cycling. So, like, I went to Miami a little while ago, and the fact that in Miami they had a sort of one of these bike nights and stuff like that was terribly important to people, that somehow it symbolised sort of taking the street backs from the car and all of that. But the other thing is trams. Is that everywhere people are reinventing trams. Having ripped them out in the 50s, they're going back to them. And it's a really interesting example of how an old thing, gains new life and salience, and actually it's sort of unwise to write things off entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I feel that I did have a question to ask you about empathy, but somebody I'm sure will ask that.
I'm just interested to, actually you're almost sort of touching on it with public transport, but I'm a little concerned that there's been no mention of convertibles, global warming, and how all this fits into making great cities, because health, this is the biggest thing that's facing all of us now, and has been for the last 40 years, but unfortunately the politicians haven't realised that until now. And here in Australia, I don't think they're realising yet. But I'd just be interested to know how that ties in. And if I may just make a lighter comment, your preference for the automatic flushing toilets, I was thinking that a lot of our absentee owners of lots and lots of apartments in Melbourne and around, they're being criticised for having all this space lying empty, and there are suggestions that they should be allowing people to rent those places. But of course they say they can't pick them up because there's no use of water, so they don't pick them up, that the flats aren't not being used. But that's just I think that perhaps they might welcome the automatic flushing toilets.
Yes, it kind of raises the whole possibility that there's a sort of job of the future called automatic flushing toilet engineer or kind of maintenance man or something like that, doesn't it? The environmental stuff and global warming actually, I think, is absolutely central to cities, and it's going to be part of this shift of emphasis and power from nations to cities, because what you saw after Trump's Paris stuff was US cities responding in an incredibly powerful way. And actually most of the problem and most of the solution is going to lie in cities. And that means a kind of innovation which is going to be a mixture of sort of low tech, low energy, but also new tech and sort of highly sophisticated reusing of energy in all sorts of different forms. And so that, I think, is going to be absolutely central to culture. So back to those places in Vauban in Freiburg. The amazing thing, Freiburg is sort of the home of the green movement in Germany, and that started when a previous German administration suggested building a nuclear power plant there, and it sort of started the green movement in Germany. But the really impressive thing about those flats are that they are built so that the average energy bill is 50 euros a year. 50 euros a year. Now, you're not earning very much because your earnings are pretty flat, or you're on middle earnings, and someone has just given you an energy bill of 50 euros a year because the insulation is so good and the sort of recycling systems are so good. That's really, really powerful. And that's where I think we need to get with that whole thing, is that it becomes a deal. It becomes like, how could you resist that? It becomes obvious, and that, I think, is... And the really interesting thing, going back to this sort of layering of systems and all the rest of it, is how few of the new eco-cities, which are sort of designed from scratch, are actually anything like it. And actually the most effective, I suspect, are going to be cities which work it into themselves in some kind of way, into the fabric of themselves, because very few of those showcase places like Masdar and ones in China actually are getting anywhere near what they think they are, because they're pure systems. There's no empathy, there's no social life, there's no embedding of it in the life of the city. They're just designed entirely from the outside.
Okay.
Oh, hi. Absolutely fascinating talk. I'm very interested in the idea of health and wellbeing. And I was intrigued to see Chinese citizens using a playground, and I want them everywhere. I just think that too much of the green space is used for young people and football clubs and cricket. What about the older population who would like exercise and a walking track that's actually flat so we don't break our ankles, and some equipment that we can use to build up the muscles that just aren't working the way they should? Are there these adult playgrounds actually in London, or is this a Chinese model?
So the important thing about the Chinese model is that it's sort of embedded in culture, and it's collective. And so we do have them. And I do think that in London, it's an interesting thing, because the presence of those sorts of outdoor playgrounds or that outdoor gyms is, I think, a signal to people, oh, this is a good place. But actually they're not used anywhere near as much as they could be, because they need animating. And to animate them, you need people and people to organise them and stuff. And no one has yet sort of really properly found a way to do that. But I mean, slightly, and so I think all of that health and well-being stuff and rethinking the gym industry, which I think is a sort of broken industry in a way. I mean, it's selling a fake product, I think, in some kind of way. So I think there is a big opportunity for someone to completely reinvent the gym in the way that people have reinvented restaurants and food and stuff like that. And I think it's just waiting to be taken by someone. But the really interesting thing about my local park, Highbury Fields, which was a market garden, is that on a Saturday, it becomes, at least for Saturday morning, like a gym. It's absolutely extraordinary. There are more people in Lycra than, they're just all over the place. Because first of all, there's a park run, which is now gets 400 people to it. And then they're just people working out with trainers all over this public space. And I think that's fantastic. I think it's really, really great.
But I think it goes back to this point about, connecting to the traditions that exist or have existed. So it just made me think about, British playgrounds that we would have known, kind of slides and swings. And it's how you would reanimate something that had the memory of that.
Yeah.
But served a slightly different purpose, and which, younger people wouldn't go anywhere near, but older people would connect with.
Yeah. Yeah, and why is it that gyms are almost exclusively really pretty much for younger people who are sort of working out in that Lycra-driven way? And what would it be like if you really had a place which was about sort of mind, body and spirit, and connected you to other people and maybe to nature in some sense, and was sort of as easily accessible as a library in terms of kind of age. That I think that's a really big opportunity, I think, still waiting to be taken.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk, it was fascinating. I'm really curious about, I guess, the role of empathy and some of those initiatives which really help fight against that really strong feeling I know I have in this city of being atomised a lot of the time and isolated. They're quite simple, and so I'm just curious about your views on the role of technology in contributing to a really strong bed of empathy in our city.
Well, I suppose what I thought was, what I came away was thinking that there were these things called social technologies which got people together, and actually the time I suppose that came home to me most was I went to a city in the States called Charlotte, which has an incredible history of both racial integration and segregation. And it's an extraordinary city. It's a kind of gateway city now for Mexican immigrants, and it's a kind of really interesting place. Very, very weird in some ways. And traces its roots back, called Charlotte because it traces, that was the Queen's wife, and they called themselves Charlotte to become friends with the king, and it's a very strange place. But they had this amazing initiative to plant 1 million trees, and I talked to the guy whose idea it was and who ran this initiative, and he said it's really got nothing to do with trees. Basically, the trees are a means to get people together. So if you can get people together to plant the trees and then talk about it and then look after the trees, the multiplier effect is absolutely enormous. And so that, it seemed to me, was a sort of really simple example of a sort of a social technology at work. And I think we need more things like that. Now, I think this stuff in our pockets can do that some of the time, and it's really useful for that. But I think it's also deeply distracting, and kind of, it's a way of sort of ourselves cutting ourselves off from the rest of life in the city in some way, and saying we're not available to it, which, I mean, is good and useful at some points, but would be bad if it were addictive and kind of an escape into that. So that's what I would, simple chairs, simple, it's sort of things like that I think are really important, not fancy things.
Hi, Charles and Helen. I'm just wondering if either of you, or both of you actually, could comment on the importance of diversity, creating diverse places in cities so that you can engender that conversation, have that conversation of empathy. Many times in the media we have highlighted the cities like Roubaix, Marseille in France, and even Birmingham in the UK, where they speak about the ghettos. And then we've also got examples of inclusionary zoning in other cities where you tried to break that down by making it compulsory to have 20, let's say even 30% of cities that are composed of affordable and social housing and eclectic communities. How important is that to include it into cities? Is it really that important? Or maybe it's not that important? Because I'd highlight the example that I had in 2 months in Birmingham. I had a year in England, and I had a wonderful time in a suburb of Spark Hill in Birmingham, where it's probably well over 85-90% South Asian. I felt very welcome there, quite safe actually. So perhaps it's not that important, but what do you think?
Well, I think diversity is really critical to the success of cities, because they thrive on difference, basically. And so cities which are good at attracting and then integrating people rapidly into their existing networks, I think, are cities that succeed. And that's what I mean by this sort of empathy thing, of being able to overcome difference and to make a leap to see the world from the point of view of someone else, and to then care about what that sort of leap tells you. And I think there is evidence from work in the States, for instance, from Raj Shetty's work, that more diverse areas which are integrated are more socially mobile, and that if you can get a mixture of social diversity but also civic care, that signals something about neighbourhoods that then leads to sort of more investment coming in. The things that I would stress, I suppose, are three. One is the critical role of culture, broadly speaking, that cultural expression and access to public culture through food and through other things is really critical to that, both expression and recognition that needs to go on. The second is, as I said, transport, that if you can get on a bus and it can take you to a market or an event or a job or what have you, you can feel part of the city. So I think transport is really important. But the other is markets, is that, people need entrepreneurial opportunities to enter markets. And so markets, in the broadest sense, need to be open and not closed. And so therein lies, one of the troubling dilemmas of London, certainly in Paris, which is, I am a real supporter of black cabs and the knowledge and all the rest of it, but that's quite a closed market for understandable reasons, whereas Uber is a very open market. And if you're just arriving in London, then actually starting work with Uber is really easy. The black cab driver will tell you they've just come to work for Uber, that's all they've come for, or they're on benefits and they're working for Uber. And so there is a real dilemma and debate about the relationship between these two worlds. So, and those, I think one of the things that I would go back to with the Brexit debate is that we just didn't have debates like that kind of openly enough and clearly enough. They were all sort of swept under the carpet a bit. But actually they need to be had, and they need to be resolved in some kind of way so that these two worlds can sort of coexist and get along.
And I think that issue of managing, creativity with care is it's such a delicate balance that when the market has just gone too far. And I think that's one of the challenges with all sorts of new technologies, whether it's Uber or not, although Uber's probably the one that has, people have the most conversations about now, is how you think about, in the broadest possible sense, how do we care about citizens and their ability to make a living, and what does that then mean for what we may or may not permit, as opposed to a kind of just a sort of creative destruction while everything changes, and so black cab drivers will just have to get on with it, because if the net result of this is everybody's wages being depressed, then that's not going to help.
And no one's driving in 5 years' time because Uber's got drones doing it, or something like that. But that's why I think cities are great places to have those conversations about, getting beyond that Silicon Valley model about creative destruction and disruptive innovation, and which I think should sort of be banned, or not banned, but I think we've got to have a discussion about innovation which is about public purpose and civic life, not just about kind of one company coming along and disrupting another regardless of the consequences.
And I think that's where the conversation about the empathy is really helpful. I used to live in Spark Hill. Yes, we'll go to you.
Thanks for the talk. I suppose we'd be remiss though, when we have great cities, we try and bring people together, and I know what is now a hole in the ground, but they had a pop-up shop near what was 80 Collins Street, Nauru House, where it was a desert, and they put up some pop-up shops, and I've never seen more activity, sort of in an area in the evenings where there's just a few food stalls, people able to talk, and it was a great thing. But the dark side, when Melbourne's one of the 100 Rockefeller resilient cities, is if you attract, lots of people, lots of together, we also have other security and other problems. So I suppose I'd be interested in your comment about how do you retain that success, but do it in a way which also protects the interests as far as you can against extremism or other threats.
London's had 2 serious incidents now, I would say that in that framework that we've got there, that systems and empathy thing, that it's going to be a mixture of better systems of information intelligence, better protection, stuff like that, but not in a way, I hope, that would undermine the sort of civic life of the city, because what those guys were attacking was difference. What they were attacking was people mixing, and they were attacking the sort of secular life of a mixed city. What they were trying to defend was purism, in a sense, of separation. And so what cities have got to stand for is kind of openness, mixing and sharing, basically. So whatever we do has to be led, I think, by those principles in some sense. And that I continue to believe that the best people to police the city are the citizens, and that actually citizens are the best way to kind of make the city safe, because they are its sort of body of safety in some sense. And that should include all sorts of communities. And probably part of the problem in London is that connection is not made enough in some sense. So I'm sort of loath to react. I was actually when one of those incidents happened soon after, I was in Tel Aviv, and the Israeli reaction was really kind of, sort of very visceral, which was, this has to be sorted out, by which they meant sort of military intervention or something like that. That would be completely counterproductive, it seems to me.
Thanks. So I originally grew up in the Geelong region, and also last year studied in Birmingham. So my experiences from going from the regional or the little sister cities to then your Melbourne or your London has always been very different. So I'm wondering, to get your opinion, do you think there's a place to make cities like London and Melbourne more livable, that you need to focus outside those cities to the other regional cities around the place?
I visited Geelong a week ago. Yeah, we could all go and live there. Yeah. I mean, no, I think that one of the things that's going to happen with London is I think there's going to be quite a lot of growth in medium-sized cities as well as megacities. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of growth in sort of second and third cities, which will have quite interesting and distinct characters. So this thing where I went to Charlotte, North Carolina, that's got a really distinctive character, as has Miami. I mean, Miami's a really, really different place, as is San Jose. So I think there's a real opportunity with global cities becoming more like themselves, for second and third cities becoming more distinctively provincial, regional, and having their own special character and flavour. And I think the other thing that you see in London is young, which is a real problem. I mean, London, I think a couple of things. The problem with London is London has benefited hugely from this infusion of skilled foreign labour over the last 10 years. So if it loses that, but at the same time it's pricing out 30-year-olds who can't afford to live there because they're going to Bristol or Bath or somewhere else up a train line, Leeds or what have you, that's going to be a big issue. I think more and more people are trying to do that, and they'll come to London for a couple of days maybe and live in someone's back room and stuff like that. So you'll see more of that, I think, of the sort of almost the spreading of the tentacles of London. People live somewhere else but still be connected to this huge sort of global source of kind of energy, capital, awfulness, greatness, all at the same time. See what I mean? That, yeah. So I think there will be that sort of division of labour, if you like, developing. So I know one company, for instance, who has an office in London, has about 30 people there, has 500 people in Porto, and with EasyJet you can easily commute from Porto to London. And Porto is a great place to work. So I think you'll see, Brexit willing, more of that kind of interaction going on, yeah.
It's not so good for the environment, though.
No.
And with that, there are always trade-offs, there are always dilemmas, but please all join me in thanking Charlie for a great experience.